I think of the lives we had and the lives we could have had should history have taken a different route. But history kept dissolving in our hands. The past is nothing but lies written by those who claim to be the devil's rejectors. Witches. 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 A word that burns the soul. Summons the unimaginable and recalls the unthinkable.
No one can really imagine that Scotland, which is known for its beauty and friendly people, could have once been dominated by pure panic and anger. Over centuries, people believed that the devil was at work in these lands. Satan was thought to be recruiting secret agents to execute his will. Over centuries, no one, absolutely no one, was safe from accusations of practicing black magic. In the late 16th and 17th century, between 3,000 and 4,000 people were tortured and executed as witches, a group identified as a total threat. But why was witch hunting so severe in this country?
Particularly in the 17th century, the 1600s, where you get a lot of witch trials across Europe, Scotland is probably the only country in Europe that is like a religious police state. And that's because you have what's a local parish committee or church court called the Kirk Session that by the mid-17th century was established across many parishes in Scotland. And that really enforced godly behaviour, punished discipline in every single village, nearly every single village. So you had the church was really inside people's daily lives all the time. And they were there to not just punish witchcraft, but other forms of ungodliness, fornication, drunkenness, adultery. And combined with this really invasive sort of religious church court system, you also had a very prominent belief that the devil was at work in Scotland, that witches were on the increase because it was the last days. And so they're the two main reasons why you have such an intense witch hunt in Scotland, as I said, the decentralised legal system and really intense religious fervour.
After the Witchcraft Act was approved in 1563, the authorities were technically legally entitled to hunt, slaughter and kill anyone who was found in suspicious activities. Whether motivated by religious zeal or naked opportunism, witch hunting was pursued with remarkably more favour in Scotland than in England. The persecution against witches increased when King James VI, who was Mary Queen of Scots' son, returned to Scotland upon his honeymoon in Scandinavia. He believed witches provoked a magical storm in an attempt to sink his ship by which he and his bride, Anne of Denmark, were travelling. This led to the North Berwick witches, the first major trial of witchcraft under criminal law. After that, women were persecuted relentlessly. Following the king's revenge, persecution reached unthinkable levels. Human cruelty had no limits.
Sometimes when you say, oh, probably 4,000 or 5,000 women died, you get a kind of, 4,000 or 5,000 people, we see these, that amount of people dying routinely in lots of different ways. It's maybe the cancer figures for a particular year or something. It doesn't seem like it's as present as it is in a community that's only about 1 million strong.
Witches have often been perceived in one certain light: nasty, malformed and evil. However, the majority of the accused were actually ordinary folks who died because of what they said or was said about them.
not many accused witches confessed voluntarily. They were tortured, or what we would consider now to be torture. So the most common form of interrogation method was called sleep deprivation, which was sometimes called waking or watching. So that's sometimes described in the record where it's written the accused was watched, or the accused was, these men watched the witch for 3 or 4 nights. And that was the method of not essentially allowing the suspect in prison to fall asleep. Maybe every 1 or 2 hours they would start to drift off, and then the people would come back in and wake them up. And that was obviously to get them to confess.
Some witches were targeted as the accuser had something to gain from their death: money, lands, goods, you name it. Often, under torture, one accused person would accuse others, and those people would, in turn, be arrested and tortured and name names. Soon, cells were filled with innocents. And although there was no discrimination based on gender when it came to having supernatural abilities, the records show that more women practiced quote-unquote witchcraft. So because it was mainly purely against women, could that be the reason why the history of witchcraft in Scotland has never been fully acknowledged? Many argue that society doesn't take witchcraft seriously because it's something that happened just too long ago. But is that actually true? Why do we have to commemorate these people at this moment in time?
We are connected. We are connected to our past, and our lives today come from our past. And as far as I'm concerned, it's very difficult to plan your future without understanding properly where you come from. And it's actually not that many generations ago. If you think there are perhaps 4 generations every century, it's maybe the end of it is maybe 12 women back, 13 women back. And we learn so much from our mothers and grandmothers, and they learned from their mothers and grandmothers. So there is a real direct social link back to that time. And you have to remember, I think people forget, the witchcraft trials went on for a couple of 100 years. So there are generations upon generations upon generations of women who are afraid. And that definitely leaves its mark on our culture today.
Witches are not necessarily the only ones excluded from history. Wherever you go in Edinburgh, you will find statues of more famous citizens. We even celebrate our animals, like Greyfriars Bobby on George IV Bridge. Whether it's plaques, memorial stones, or stained glass windows, women are constantly underrepresented in our public spaces.
If you were a Victorian man and you discovered a mathematical theorem, or you made an advance in, you discovered a lot of flowers, you were a biologist, or you were an environmentalist, or you were whatever you were, you could reasonably expect a statue to be put up to you after your death. That would have been quite a normal thing. You see this all over the centre of Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen. There are lots and lots of statues of these Victorian men. Every one of those statues can be matched by a woman who achieved just as much as that man and is not commemorated. And so if we go back to me walking on one side of George Street as a teenager and my brother walking on the other side of George Street as a teenager, all you can think of is that men have made this amazing, glorious history. Men have built the world. And what have women done? And it looks like women did nothing.
Billions of people come through to Edinburgh every year to visit Edinburgh Castle, which is definitely a lovely place to see. But what they do not know is that hundreds of accused witches were burned on the castle's esplanade, and then there is only a tiny wee plaque there that's supposed to be a memorial for witches. Unless you Google it, you are unlikely to find it. The Witch's Well, as it is called, features a bronze relief of witch's head strangled by a snake. The left panel represents the evil eye with throwing eyes and a nose. The right side, on the contrary, represents a pair of hands holding a bow, which is meant to symbolize healing hands. Even though the plaque has been there since 1912, for some it does not honor what happened during such a dark period of history. Like the charity Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland, whose members seem quite passionate about.
I had came through for the day. I saw on Five Witches Remembered Facebook page that there was a monument on the esplanade to supposedly commemorate 4,000 plus people who were murdered under the guise of witchcraft or the accusations of witchcraft. I had been up in the castle esplanade several times before, and I'd never seen it, never heard of it. So when I heard of this, I thought, we'll go and see that, see what it is. And when I got there, it was tiny, it's the size of an A4 sheet of paper. And I was really quite disappointed and quite horrified, I suppose is the best word, that this was supposed to represent all these people, because you see some of the statues everywhere, even in my local town, Greenock. There's bigger statues there to commemorate horses that worked in the mills, really, and this is supposed to represent people's lives. So the day that I came through and I found it eventually, it took me a good while to find it, I got in touch with Sheila, the chairperson in Claus, and after being in touch with Edinburgh World Heritage and finding out if there was any plans for a larger monument, and when I got in touch with Sheila, that's when she told me that was one of their aims, and told me a bit more about the group and introduced me to what they were looking to do. Invited me along to the meeting, and the rest, as I say, is history, and I love it, absolutely love it.
People don't relate quite so closely generally to medieval history as they do to that Georgian and Victorian period, which is understandable because they are much more likely to know where their family was, for example, in the Victorian era, the Georgian era. In the medieval era, for some people they know, but most people don't really know where their families were during that era. It's sort of slightly too long ago.
One of the big things that we have came across is that there are still families living today who still live under the stigma of an ancestor being accused of witchcraft, and it's obviously still a very sensitive subject, because you have to tread carefully. You have to take you can't just bulldoze through and say, I want to do this, I want this happen, I want that. You've got to take into other people's consideration, and as I say, it is a part of history, so you can't just brush history under the carpet. It needs to be acknowledged.
If you put yourself in the mindset of someone who believes in witchcraft in the 16th and 17th centuries, if you are a witch, you don't really want to announce that you're one to your neighbours and friends, because you're going to lose your surprise, your secret. They think you're a good Christian, but actually you're a devious witch. So if you going around practicing your magic secretly, then you're being able to inflict, harm on others without being suspected. It's like modern day criminals, murderers. Once you're uncovered and your identity is known, you kind of lost that power, unless you've got some sort of, you're psychotic and you like being the attention. But very soon the authorities are going to catch you and you're going to be on your way to the stake. In order to understand who we are, we have to look to the past. These people in the 16th and 17th century were very different. They believed in something called witchcraft, that historical witchcraft that we no longer believe in, which is different from modern forms of spiritual belief. But those people, who were executed in the 16th centuries, they were human, they were like us, they had similar desires, feelings, wants, as we do. We need to remember them because they were executed for a crime that didn't exist, that wasn't possible to be a crime. And if we can reckon with that part, then we can perhaps take seriously the history of the witch trials without, judging or coming to some sort of misconceptions.
Despite new technological innovations and the widespread of secular values, superstition is heavily embedded in our own contemporary mindset. Although there is not such a thing as a witch, the process whereby society tends to approach uncertainty is still very much influenced by our mystical knowledge. Could it be, however, that the history of the Scottish witch hunts is scarcely talked about because of shame, because of a narrowed education system?
I think the education system has been set up to talk about the history of the UK being the dominant history rather than the history of Scotland. And so you very rarely get anything much about Scotland. You'll occasionally get a little bit here and there, a little bit about the Red Strikes perhaps, the odd little bits and pieces, but largely we don't get taught Scottish history. So I don't think it's about shame, actually. I think in terms of the historical curriculum, I think that is about unionism. I think it's about Hanoverianism right back at its roots.
From an academic point of view, it really has only become a popular sort of period of history to take seriously, probably since the 1960s onwards. Probably, let's say, the 1970s was the turning point when historians started to think that witchcraft was a valuable thing to study.
The line between real life and imagination is not always necessarily taken for granted, though. In fact, several movements have been born across Scotland, particularly in Fife, whose intention is to face the emotional pain evoked by such false witchy tales. In the hope of bringing justice for those Scots who were caught up in allegations of witchcraft, Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland has launched a campaign for a legal pardon and a memorial. The idea behind such claims is to reivindicate the circumstances surrounding witch trials as well as the victim's demise.
Plans for the creation of a national memorial are yet to be set up, and he thought that such monument would benefit Scotland's economy in the same way as salience attracts millions of tourists to America every year. Having a place exclusively dedicated to those forgotten for centuries would be the first step to heal the wounds left by history.
My personal opinion is we need to find a good balance between remembering the witches as humans, as human beings like us who were put to death for a crime that we know now didn't exist, but also in a way that takes seriously the beliefs and values and cultures of past societies no longer present. And I think a memorial is a good way to do that, because I think it's the least judgmental form of remembrance, really. A memorial isn't rewriting history unless you put a massive plaque on it saying that witchcraft wasn't real and stuff like that, and it wasn't real to people living in the 16th century. But if you just have a memorial with the names of the accused and a bit about them, and being quite sensitive to the topic of witchcraft history and witchcraft belief as it was considered in those times, then I think that's the best way.
I think it's about understanding and honouring achievement. And so if you are constantly only seeing people honoured for their achievement if they are male and white and middle class and all those things, then it becomes more difficult for you to model on that. Role modelling is just really important to young people. So if as you're growing up you see strong women achieving things, you see strong women achieving things for centuries before, and there's statues and streets named after those women, women can do that and you're a woman and it's okay.
It's amazing how when you say to people about that we're trying to get a monument built, how many folk that's really, really keen on it, they think it should happen. Because there are so many wrongs from history that we can't get rid of them. We can't change that, but we can at least acknowledge that it shouldn't have happened. As a 50-year-old woman, I would have been accused. Absolutely. The fact I've got a black cat, I speak to it and it answers me. I'm very free thinking. Quite an independent. I like to be independent, but a lot of women were chastised for that. A lot of women were saying that there must have been somebody, the devil working behind them to get what they want.
I'm stuck in the past as a historian, but people probably see more how does the past shape our contemporary society, and if it is better for some people to believe certain things about witchcraft, such as they come from pagans, they have ancestors, etc., then let them do that. As long as it doesn't become a complete rewriting of history.
So, were witches good, or were they evil? Centuries later, will witches finally rest in peace? The truth is that the answers had never mattered until now. Their fight, their hunt from redemption, has just started.
Perhaps everyone was too naive to see it. After all, naivety overruled our sense of logic, and that led us to a paradise of enchanted magic. Everyone tells their stories through their own lenses. Was that the kind of justice they hoped to gain? For some we should have died. For others it was our time to go. I'm a stick on a broken stale. I'm a candle on a table. I'm everybody's past. Nobody's present. And the stamp of the future.